Arlene, I think you can introduce Dr. Holder now.
We're at 7:29. I'm gonna hold till 7:30.
Oh, yes.
Have some opportunity for some others to join us. Okay. Wonderful. Okay, good afternoon or well, good night, everyone. And I want to, on behalf of the Jamaica Diaspora Task Force Action Network, JD10, I would like to welcome you to our session this evening. I am going to, hopefully my extreme weather, I'm having a little rain outside, so hopefully that won't impact our my reception today. But I'd like to begin by welcoming you, of course, and thanking you all for being here, and especially to welcome our speaker, Dr. Cheryl Holder. And Dr. Cheryl Holder is a graduate of Princeton University and George Washington University School of Medicine. She's a National Health Service Corps scholar, an internist, and an HIV specialist. She has served as medical director of one of Miami's largest community health centers, and also has served on the health advisory and programmatic review panels for the National Institutes of Health, as well as for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, here in the US. She has dedicated her career to improving the health of underserved populations. In 2009, she joined the faculty of the Herbert Wertheim College of Medicine at Florida International University, and she provided education to aspiring physicians about the social determinants of health, diversity, HIV prevention, and the health impact of climate change. She served as Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, Inclusivity, and Community Initiatives until her retirement just very recently in December of last year. Her leadership roles extend to several medical and climate change focused organizations. She's president of the Florida State Medical Association, founder and co-chair of Miami-Dade's Heat Health Task Force. She's done many presentations, and one notably that we'd like to mention is her TED Talk that has over 300,000 views, and we encourage you to please take a look at the link between climate change, health, and poverty. We're so honored to have Dr. Holder, a fellow Yadi, who has agreed to freely share her expertise, her talents, and her passion with us this evening. And I am very happy to hand over the reins, Dr. Holder, to you at this time on behalf of the Task Force, and we welcome you. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for inviting me to speak. I was with the the Diaspora, probably about 10 plus years ago, and we did some work in Jamaica on HIV and in some other activities. So I'm glad to see that it's still very active. I will share my screen, and while I take care of that, I have a lot of information that I'll try and compress. And because each of these areas, when they talk about heat and health, it's massive, and it could require just each getting one topic unto itself. So, and I always do a little background on climate change so that everyone can be caught up on exactly what we're talking about and how this all evolved. So with that, I always start off with this patient. That's not her, but she reminds me very much of the patient. So I had to put this woman's picture. And this was in another very hot summer, 2016, which is now the second hottest year on record. Used to be that for so long until this year. And she had multiple medical problems, lived in a part of Miami called Opelika, which is poor. And She came in for refills, but the real issue was that she couldn't pay her light bill because she'd used so much AC trying to keep cool, but she had to choose between medication and her light bill. And I agree, she took the right choice by keeping her meds, but it created a huge area of problems. And it made me start thinking and looking at more of my patients and looking at the impact that it's had over the last how many years. So when we look at what we're talking about, why we say climate change is human made, the way that we're seeing now, it goes back to when we were seeing the natural variations in the temperature of our planet. And that stayed pretty constant till around the 1800s, when we got involved in the Industrial Revolution. To drive the Industrial Revolution, we started using fossil fuels. And so it went off the usual ebbs and flows and up and down of the temperature. And then we started seeing the gradual increase and the gradual rise, especially in the gases related to CO2 and other gases that were staying on our planet and warming the planet. So what we saw over time was a gradual shift of the temperatures, the average temperatures getting hotter. So where you may not have seen it, so a lot of the people who dismiss climate change and continue to dismiss climate change, because there is the normal pattern of our planet. But what has changed is just how rapidly that higher ranges over time. And so we're having more and more hotter days, which would be predicted by all the modeling if we had maintained CO2s over the last hundreds of years, thousands of years of our planet, the way the planet normally does it, until we started injecting other pollution in our planetary atmosphere. That's when we saw the change. So when you look at the way it's done, it's not really complicated, even though it looks complicated. The sun sends out rays, it comes down to our planet, and our planet on average absorbs enough of it and sends the rest back out in the atmosphere. Now, this is what keeps our planet just right for humans. That's why many other planets don't have humans and other animals alive, because their atmosphere does not keep the temperature just right for plants and animals to survive. So what happens as we have continued to put out the unnatural increased excess of fossil fuels and other greenhouse gases like methane and all the chemicals, the natural path for the sun rays, that the energy that's been absorbed in the water and that usually gets out, it is not being sent out into the atmosphere. It is creating, where it says greenhouse gas, like an umbrella, like a whole bubble for our planet. And that bubble is warmer and it's coming back and staying on our planet, which is then warming everything and melting the ice and creating all the problems that we're seeing now. Our ice caps at the top of the planet, at the bottom of the planet, is like a huge reflector. So when the sun rays come in, that also reflects the light back out. So the smaller amount of that ice, the less we have reflection and the more being absorbed in our planet in the water, primarily the oceans and on land. And as that absorption usually sends back out, we now have all these particles circulating in our atmosphere that's stopping it from going back out, warming the planet. Now, where are all these things coming from? Transportation, all the oil fields, all the manufacturing, our agriculture. Agriculture has become incredibly mechanized and huge, basically factories. So these farms and these cattle ranches, especially with beef production, takes up a massive amount of our earth just to feed these cows. And then the cows themselves put out methane. Then our farming uses an enormous amount of other chemicals to continue the growth, to feed the plants and to feed the cows and to feed us, and also for a lot of food waste. So when you look at how we've created our environment, we've put out too many gases that are blocking the rays from going back out and creating a huge, I say like a fleece blanket. Think of a big blanket around the planet Earth, warming us up. I know in the diaspora, I'm a doctor, and I want to bring this to what being a doctor in our health system. If we were just the US health sector alone, we'd be one of the 5th largest in the world. Our health system, because the way we do it, think about it, every time you open up a single-use scalpel and this, everything is in plastic, everything is in boxes, whole lot of packaging, everything is disposable. The gowns, the masks, the gloves, we use an incredible amount of resources to take care of only less than 300 million people on a planet of billions. We create in our health sector so much harm and so much pollution. I bring this looking at the world. I use Miami, and when we talk about vulnerability, you see all of this is happening. I use Miami as an example of what happens to the world when all this heat stays. And we can map it, and the world is mapped all over now. We can find the places that are hotter than they usually are, and the people that are living there, and what are the factors around the people who end up being most vulnerable. Miami is an example of almost every country in this world. And you know, when we talk about the global south, they're similar to what we see in Miami. So when we went to the heat vulnerability index across Miami, we saw certain areas that were just lighting up because there was less trees, less investment, poorer people, lots of concrete, and a lot of factors that made this population vulnerable. And when we look, we saw Homestead, Hialeah, Opelika, Miami Gardens, and that population were getting even more heat when it comes down on you. If you felt 90 degrees in Coral Gables, it was probably feeling more like 100 degrees in some of these areas. And when we did more mapping of these areas, we saw directly related to income. Richer you are, the healthier you are. The richer you are, the more tree cover, the more protection you have from the heat. And it linked very closely with what your neighborhood looked like and how wealthy you were. Put this across the world. When you think of sub-Saharan Africa, you think of the Caribbean, you think everywhere, the richer people are much more able to protect themselves as this planet warms and it changes. Then in certain areas, because of how we developed, where we chose to put a lot of buildings, a lot of concrete and no trees and no grass and nothing, you create this urban heat island effect. One of the hottest areas in Miami is Brickell, that's no surprise, but then all the other areas which I just showed, Hialeah, Miami Gardens, Opelika, North Miami, many of those areas were also disinvested and have the heat island effect where it's so much hotter and the population who live there will suffer more. This is look at the Caribbean just for this July. You see all this area like South Florida have been incredibly hot. And this has been what we have been expecting since the last 20, 30 years, more than that. So they've been doing climate modeling from the 60s to see what is happening. So we know we were dealing with all of this heat. You can imagine places like Cuba, Jamaica, that the winds are there, but for some of the more places like Kingston, which has a lot more concrete and a lot more density, it must have been unbearable. When we look at heat and we start predicting, we know that outdoor workers, by the time it's around 90 degrees, they're at much increased risk. Then by the time you get to 100 degrees, and we talk about heat, not so much just the actual temperature, but where it feels like it's, and that's the humidity, because humidity and how your body reacts is when we know what your body is feeling. So if it feels like 90, your body is reacting like it's 90 degrees, and outdoor workers cannot tolerate the increased stress to their bodies as well and are at very high risk for heat illness. Now, when we talk about high risk, and we're not just looking, you're always seeing farm workers, but I want you to think of the school crossing guards, the police officers, the firefighters, the custodial workers, the pool man, pool woman, the people who cut your grass. There are a lot of outdoor workers, the longshoremen, that are very much impacted by the heat when you start hitting feel-like temperature of 90. Time you feel like 100, you definitely see more increased risk of heat illnesses, heat rash, heat exhaustion, heat stroke. And heat stroke can often lead to death. And this is what was predicted before this year, that we know because of the warming, because of the greenhouse effect, that we're going to have more and more days, 100-something days by mid-century of just feel like temperatures of 90, feel like temperatures of 100. That's more than almost half the year, what we're looking at for so many of these issues. Now, what did we see? This is the really distressing side, that our predictions before this July would have been pretty good. But this July, 64 days, we are in the hundreds. We were expecting more 90s, some low hundreds, but we're in the hundreds to high hundreds over the last 64 days. And you see, this is the line in red is showing what has been our average over time for the last how many years we've been tracking this, at least 50, 60 years. Yet look at these temperatures, highs and lows, just in July. So we are very concerned that things are accelerating more than the models had predicted. Now, we talk about health, and we know that health is determined not so much by your genes, and it becomes more and more evident, which is good that folks are beginning to accept this, but it's much more the social determinants, your socioeconomic factors, your physical environment, what kind of care you're going to receive, and your health behaviors. But health behaviors also goes back very closely to your socioeconomics and some of your cultural aspects. So knowing this, we know who are most impacted by this climate change and who will be at greatest risk. And so we definitely know that younger people, they do not have the policy ability to, they don't have the ability to vote and make policy that protects them. Folks who are outdoors and play sports, they're out there in the environment, so their physical environment is going to overpower a lot. We look at pregnant women because their physiology has changed. They definitely, especially poor pregnant women who live in those heat islands, are going to be at greater risk of getting exposed to these temperatures. And with the temperature, one of the things I may not have mentioned earlier, but is the nighttime temperature that doesn't go down, especially in the urban heat islands, because the concrete and the ground releases heat at night. So it would go back out. So you're now living in these areas where you really cannot get cooling at night, and in the daytimes are unbearably hot. Elderly folks, we understand elderly, especially your physiology changes as you get older. You don't recognize thirst as well. Your kidneys don't concentrate urine as well. So you're very much more at risk. And you also tend to have more chronic diseases. And without money, how can you pay these exorbitant light bills? If you're living now in Miami, I don't know if you saw your light bill for the last month, but it's double and triple what it usually is. If you have limited resources, how are you affording to pay for these bills? And you can be like my patient Anime. The heat-related costs are astronomical. Now, many times we see hospitalization just on heat, emergency department use, but what folks don't take into account is that the heat results in triggering and decompensating other stable illnesses. So they will present not just for heat, but also for worsening of the heart failure, falling off ladders because they got dizzy when they were working, or the kidneys getting a little bit worse because they're chronically dehydrated. Or what we find with heat, everybody knows you get a little hot and bothered, and that leads to more violent behavior. So all of this results in tremendous cost to our health system. We did the evaluation in Miami-Dade County, and the excess deaths from heat is over 34 for the year. Now, we know heat, the people will die all the time, regardless of what other reasons, but just because of heat, we have tracked it as excess of 34. we have already exceeded the number of hot car deaths in Florida. Then usually it's about 6, we're already at 7. These are people who forget the kids in the car and they die. And we're already, because there's so many more hot days for the year, we've seen increased numbers. Just 2 weeks ago, a worker in Homestead, a farm worker, died, a 29-year-old. So this is not a surprise. And that's why when we say heat is the #1 weather-related killer in the United States, it's heat. When you look at all the health impacts from climate change, heat illness, heat is #1, but then all the factors around it. The pollution that we talked about also exacerbates heart and lung conditions, but then heat does too. Asthma, traumatic injuries. Now, traumatic injuries happen with the heat related to heat, but also after a storm. What happens after storms? Because we know hurricanes are more intense with our climate change. Bigger areas, lots more water, more intense, a lot more injuries. We know all about the diarrheal indices that happen after the flooding. And we find in Florida, especially in Miami, with our septic tanks that overflow and flow into the bay and into our water table, the heat increases the growth of bacterial content. So it increases the risk of our water being more contaminated. Allergies, we see from the climate, because of that high CO2, your trees, if you have a mango tree, an agate tree, any tree in your backyard, it grows rapidly. And you must be spending a ton of money trying to prune it and control it. Or if you haven't, it is way up in the sky. Everything is growing faster, and it does increase the amount of flowering and the amount of allergies. And trees are moving into communities, into areas that we didn't see before. Breadfruit is predicted to probably grow all the way in Virginia by the mid-century. And breadfruit is one of these very tropical trees, yet we're seeing breadfruit survive in South Florida and moving north. Vector-borne diseases, we can get as a whole nother talk on malaria, which showed up in Sarasota in June. And we see it because mosquitoes with heat and warmer temperatures, especially humidity and heat, they replicate, they can live, their cycle is shorter and they can live in the water and they create the problems. And other vectors, a whole bunch of other infections that we're seeing. And of course, the blood-borne diseases, the emotional stress that we expect just from dealing with the stress. The pregnancy we talked about, we've seen stillborn, premature, underweight babies because the moms are more dehydrated. These are more data from our country, from the US. Many of the other countries do not track this, but there's possibly some relationship, especially with the pollution and the heat. And we would have to see how other countries are doing as the temperatures rise. Again, more morbidity or mortality related to heat. And when you think of humid heat, the heart has to work harder. The kidneys are working harder. The sweat doesn't cool you as much because you need breeze to move that sweat and move across your skin to really cause the cooling. That's why at a certain temperature, a hot fan blowing hot air does not cool you. And that's one of the things we got to tell elderly and tell folks, go to a cooling center, get out of that hot house because you're not able to sweat and you cannot cool your body. Just showing how the mosquito range has moved already up in the US. And I just want to get to some of the solutions that we are looking at here in the US, especially Miami, and what's required. This is just an example of all the groups that are collaborating to be able to address the climate change and just around heat. And without collaboration, and for many of the lower wealth countries, the collaboration has got to go beyond their borders into to WHO and to the richer countries to be able to find solutions that will help to protect these islands and protect these countries. Just in Jamaica alone, sea level rise and beach erosion has taken off many beaches. If anybody has been to Hellshire Beach recently, that's lost over 400 feet, over 400 feet of sand based on the receding of the shoreline from beach erosion. And so now there really is very little beach. That's happening across many of these countries. And for us in Dade County, we got together a large coalition of folks to be able to address heat. And we were able to get a large foundation, Adrian Arsh Foundation, who is starting to get heat officers throughout the world. And Jane Gilbert, which was funded by this foundation, created the first heat officer in the entire world. But heat is a #1 weather-related killer, not just for the US, but for the whole world. And we have to get the resources together to be able to combat it. And you see some of the other heat officers, other parts of the world. We have a climate and heat health task force. So as you create, and I do this for the diaspora, because as the heat reaction response, you really need task force that links the heat and health so that we get solutions that improve the health of the community. I chair one of the task force to make sure that the research is being done, researching what's happening, who's getting sick from heat, how is it being reported, how are the doctors training. We created an extreme heat action plan, and this is with the county, and they have 3 goals in the county: inform, prepare, and protect people, cool our home and emergency facilities, and cool our neighborhoods. And in informing, prepare, protect, you should have been, if you live in Dade County, you hear the messaging. You hear all the turning the libraries into cooling centers, all the parks are cooling centers, educating, training different people in the parks. There's heat training sessions in all throughout Dade County, especially in the vulnerable communities. My role as the doctor in the group is to get doctors trained and nurses trained, and we have different resources. We have CME courses, and we're going into hospitals and clinics taking this information. One of the other areas we'll look at is cooling homes and emergency facilities. Many of the homes in the low-income communities do not have AC. And if they do have AC, they cannot afford to run and pay the bills. So that's one of the areas that they've looked at. How can we improve this? Getting dollars. Luckily, the US is very wealthy, and the Inflation Reduction Act from the Biden administration, which is the largest climate mitigation adaptation bill ever. And this is where dollars have come down. Dade County has received dollars to be able to equip and retrofit many of the low-income Section 8, the federal housing with air conditioners. But most of poor people live in rentals that are owned by private people, small 3-family buildings, and the dollars are there in some capacity through this, through the Inflation Reduction Act. But we are getting dollars. If you have churches out there, find out the churches, there are dollars for the churches to go solar. There's community solar. There are things for electric vehicles, and you get different tax rebates trying to get more electrification and decreasing fossil fuel. There are dollars to paint your roofs white because white reflects back out the sun. So there are lots of areas that we're looking at to try and cool the home. And of course, the neighborhood, Dade County does not have great tree canopy. I think it's only maybe 20%. They're trying to increase the tree canopy, especially in poor communities. And we're definitely asking folks to plant more trees. And there are different programs to help protect and take care of the trees. So that's one of the areas that they're looking at, how to cool the schools, how to cool the community, and getting the word out. There are many research through the University of Miami, FIU, that are bringing sensors in the neighborhood. They put sensors at the bus benches to see how hot it is. And the goal is trying to put shelters on all bus shelters and improve the public transportation so people don't have to stand under the heat while they're waiting for a bus. This is our program that we're getting. We do virtual education. This can be done. You see 33,000. It's not a lot of money in the US, but there are ways in other countries that you can get clinicians together to use our trusted voices and do education throughout the communities about heat. We do health center trainings. We also, these are materials that were provided by the county, and we bring these materials to the different sites, and we give access to more information that the doctors and the sites can do to educate the population. Quite doable, not as expensive, and we look at low-cost ways to reach out and educate our communities on heat. We also teach the doctors how to tell them the right code so they can get reimbursed. We also look at policy. Policy is tremendous. Policy is the most important thing that's going to get the change. One of the big things that we did was, when do we alert our community to the problem? We were able to get the National Weather Service to say, let's not wait till it's 115 degrees like they used to. Let's do it earlier. Let's bring it at 110. Let's bring the warning, the advisory at 105 and the warning at 110, because we know the health data says by a feel-like temperature of 90 degrees, outdoor workers are at risk. By the time you get to 110, everybody's at risk. Why are we waiting for 115 and higher before we alert people? Because we know the data shows it's lower. So we were able to get that. That's why you're hearing so much announcements. And more countries are going to have to figure out what is the safest temperature to alert people so that they can be prepared to combat the heat. Go to cooler places, have more water, stay indoors, do the necessary things to protect themselves. The other thing that we're working on is with outdoor workers, especially farm workers, is to get an ordinance. There is no protection in any law, whether it's federal or state or county, that protects outdoor workers like farm workers. Now, you'll say, why don't they just stop working and rest? Especially on farms, it's not so close where the bathrooms are. There are no trees next to the plants. So they need to have some time that they're protected and paid so they don't lose money when they stop working, to go and get some water break and cool. And so the goal is that the ordinance is to help them every 4 hours to get rest. Also to educate. Many people don't understand that heat illness can go from heat exhaustion to heat stroke in a matter of very short time. Because especially if you come into it where you're not hydrated at night, because you're already hot and sweating all night, you get up and you rush and you go out to work and you're not fully hydrated, you can go tip over very early. Also, elderly tips over earlier. Children can not recognize the signs and keep playing and can tip over. So education is necessary to prevent more deaths. So one of the ordinance is to educate the employers and the employees on how to best respond to heat. So these are some of the push that we're getting to get. Hopefully we'll get it. Went through the first step in July, and we're hoping to get through the second step in September. So there'll be some protection for outdoor workers. The danger that we're facing, we have only warmed over 2 degrees Fahrenheit from the pre-industrial times. And before the Industrial Revolution, we knew the ups and downs, and that stayed consistent. And they went through the sea ice and the circles and the plants, and they see this pattern for thousands of years until the 1800s. We have gone up 2 degrees. And I tell people, think of it like a baby. When your baby, newborn baby, goes up to, 98 to 100, you're a little worried. We are very worried because the planet has already demonstrated all these extreme weathers. I didn't even go through all the extreme weather wildfires related to the heat and the drought and the storms and the flooding and everything that we're seeing all over the world. The 2 degrees would represent that turning point where it's so disrupted that we'll go through massive extinction of plants and animals, and people who are most vulnerable will not come back from it as easily. And we think of much more of the poor countries in the world that will suffer. The US is very wealthy. There are parts of Europe that's very wealthy and can combat the warmer temperatures, but it won't be so easy for the rest of us and the rest of the world. And this is what we're looking at if we do not control our emissions. This is my patient, Jorge. That really is him. And that's where he lived up until he died. And he, as you can tell, his kidneys were going. And it was a chronic gradual decline. The nighttime he couldn't cool. He had no AC. It was hot. He was older. He died from other causes, but there was just, I saw it and there's very little we could do. But he said, rain or shine, cold or heat, I have to work. He was undocumented, he had to work, and he supported his family back home until he passed. But he did this for us so we can remember and use it as an instruction for us who have survived to try and save ourselves and do more for our communities. I have more. There's each of those topics that I reviewed would be an hour in themselves when I show the pathophysiology behind it and all the steps that we have to take. But you can follow me on Instagram and TikTok, where I go through different topics on climate change health. And on Instagram, we have instructional videos that are very short on FL Clinicians or on Facebook. So you can get an idea more and keep the education going, and knowing that we have time to make some concrete actions, especially voting, and voting for people who believe in climate change, voting for people who want to fund the changes, the things that we have to do. And at this point, the only party that is consistently saying that we don't need to slow the action down is the Democratic Party. I'm just going by facts. I'm not telling you how to vote. But at this point, the Republican Party is putting forth a Project 2025 that is going to roll back much of what we're dealing with now in a slower approach, because they don't believe that the Industrial Revolution and what we've done to our planet is the underlying factor. And there can be ways that we can keep fossil fuel going while we adapt. That it's possible if this was like 50 years ago, but based on our data now, and especially what we've seen with this year, it looks very unlikely. So we need to push for policy for the world, for governments that will support helping poorer countries, helping poorer people get the solutions that will help the rest of the planet while it's helping the poor people. And it's simple. It's trees. It's a plant-based diet. We get off all that red meat. Our hearts get better. We live longer. Walking more, public transportation, getting out of our cars gets us healthier. Cutting down pollution decreases our cancer. So there's all the solutions that help poor people help our health and will move us closer to less pollution and a planet that survives for the next 100 years for our children and grandchildren in the next 7 generations. So thank you, and I'll take any questions.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Holder, for that thought-provoking presentation. We have a question from YouTube. We're live on YouTube also. So the first question is from Marsha Mullings, and she said, she's asking, what are your suggestions for managing the effects of heat among low-income individuals? For renters, and there's a second part, for renters who have little control over air conditioning. Well, no, it's not a second part. I think it's a continuation. For renters who have little control over air conditioning, solar, etc.
Yeah, that's our challenge. Now, what we've had, when you look at the data, when you look at the resources that are there, if there is any air conditioning, there is separate funds, the Energy Relief Fund. It's High Leaf. I always forget the name of these acronyms, but there is a fund there that will help to pay the bills in Florida to support some of the energy issues, because the energy burden is real. Now, we encourage people, do the things, close your cover up, don't let the sunlight come in. Especially between 10 and 2, close everything, keep the indoor dark. The fan, if it's not too hot, then you can keep your fan, and you only need to use the fan when you're in front of it. If you're out of the room, you don't have to waste your electricity running your fans, because fans work by moving air across your skin, and that then makes the sweat, cools you. So if you're not in the room, turn it off and save the energy. Turn off all the lights. stop using any equipment in your home that can increase the internal temperature. And if it gets very hot at 90 degrees, find a friend that you can go and sleep over at their home. Get cooling during the day, leave the hot apartment, leave it closed, then go back to the library or a mall or anywhere that's cooling. It's very difficult when you're low wealth. Go outside if there's air and breathing, so it's not hot and dense and humid in your house, and also fluids. Water is sufficient. You don't need to buy expensive drinks. Water. Tap water also is good. And wet yourself up. Go sit in the cool bathtub if you really have nowhere else to go.
Excellent. Thank you.
Michelle Hilton is trying to stir the pot, I think, with her question. Michelle Hilton has asked that, Dr. Holder, if you could repeat what was said about voting, especially who supports efforts to improve climate change.
Right. Based on what we're seeing, the effort to move it faster and also what we call equity. There is a part of the climate projection what has spent now called Justice 40, which means that at least 40% of everything you do has got to go back to help the folks who paid the highest price for the climate change. Remember when the Industrial Revolution came along and they were making all these factories and all this pollution and the highways went in, where did they put it? In poor neighborhoods. Poor neighborhoods that in this country were pretty much Black and brown. So who needs the improvement more rapidly because they've been dying from the pollution. They've been dying from asthma because all the highways are going through all the production, all the dumps, everything is in that. So the policies now are saying money has got to go to those areas to help that community better and faster. And I say yes to do that because the solutions that come from those communities will benefit all of us. Because if we find ways to get trees into these communities rapidly and get those trees the right height at the right trees that can produce also food, everybody benefits. If we can find ways to get those communities solar affordably, everybody benefits. So that's what the policies now say. The money for electric vehicles, that's going to be over, I think 5-10 years. Many of the improvements will go for 10 years. The new administration, if they get in, they've already put out a Project 2025 that says much of the diversity equity initiatives that take care of the people who suffered and that will help learn and improve the health of those populations will end. Much of the support for rapid electrification will end. And they're going to do a much more tailored, what's called clean gas and clean coal will take priority over solar.
I'm so glad Michelle asked that.
So I can only tell you what they put out. Truly, I am very much focused on health. I'm not saying that some of these other things like carbon capture won't work. However, capturing the carbon and leaving the folks right next to the carbon factory and killing you from all the pollution that's continued. And then you're going to capture the pollution. You're still living next to the dump. You're still living next to oil fields. You're still living next to coal-fired plants, killing you, cancer, heart disease, lung disease. So I am not for any policies that's not looking at going at renewable energy like solar. It's there, it doesn't put out the pollution. So that's where my inclination is based on health. And I tell folks, health is much more important than whether we make a ton of money capturing carbon so the rest of us can, the few people on this planet can continue to live beautifully.
I would like to ask, I think that this is really just eye-opening for all of us. And I didn't think about like your school worker, your crossing guards, as you said. And in Jamaica, we have a lot of people, we have a lot of outdoor activities, a lot of outdoor workers. You mentioned, I've seen roofers in this heat. I've seen roofers that I'm amazed at how they're doing their jobs. is there, can we talk about some things that they can do individually to help themselves?
Parts of the world, like you remember, what was that place that had the huge World Cup? And they had tremendous heat. So
Mhm.
starting times for work has changed in some of these countries,
Mhm.
like outdoor markets.
Mm,
Instead of setting up your outdoor markets between 10 and 2, they're trying to get cover and bring outdoor markets, the night markets, much more night markets, if it's relatively safe, or doing earlier. So because that daytime market is unbearably hot. Now, when you think of who's at the market, women. So the other areas that we see that is really tremendous is the women across the world are paying a huge price for this climate change because they're in the market. They're often the ones going to get water. They're often the ones farming. And so we see that the protection for women has got to be even more so by some of our changes. So for roofers, many times you're seeing them starting earlier or they're going back a little bit later and they're taking off in the middle. But overall production and productivity is projected to decline across the world because of this problem, because people cannot work for several months out of the year for at least 3-4 hours in the day.
Okay, Dr. Holder, I have a question, but I'll wait because there's a question from YouTube, again from Marsha Mullins. Dr. Holder, you spoke about tree canopies and park space. There are studies that suggest that tree canopies and park spaces are more prevalent in wealthier neighborhoods. What are your thoughts about that?
If
And
you look at the map I showed,
Yes.
where we mapped Miami-Dade County,
Yes, we
well
did.
correlated directly with the tree canopy. You just got to drive around any rich
Yes.
neighborhood and you see the trees. Now, developers, this is where policy can happen. Developers want to make more money per acre, and how many units. So they will start their land, the property, as close to the street as possible. So many times there's no room left for the trees. And the government and our policymakers says it's okay. So this is again where we got to put politicians and the community has got to speak up and say, we want sidewalks and we want trees. Then you can develop.
So Marsha's follow-up question, is this a policy issue? And you just touched on that.
Totally everything. Well, the whole world is policy.
Policy driven.
Everything is policy. That's the policy. I usually tell my students, your health is determined by where you live, where you work, where you play. Your access to money and power, which drives the policy.
Mhm.
Yes, access to money and power drives policy. And the policy is what then determines how healthy you are and how long you live.
Thank you. My question is, you mentioned earlier that the Inflation Reduction Act has provisions for churches and private organizations to make some changes related to mitigation strategies regarding climate. How do they access these funds? I mean, do they know that these funds are available?
Okay, now not private, nonprofit, not private for profit, but there are dollars in the, if you go onto Justice 40, if you go onto EPA.gov, or you go onto the whitehouse.gov, there's a whole climate office out of the White House.
Mhm.
And that website gives you lots of different ways to figure out where the dollars are. However, more churches, the community development organizations in the county are also trying to get access to the dollars.
Okay.
Some cities, I haven't heard it yet in Miami-Dade County, and I'm trying to find out more. The other cities have created organizations that go and get the dollars in one pot, and then the churches apply to them. But it's for churches, especially in Black communities. It's also for the federally qualified health centers. They have a separate pot of money that they can go and access. Now, part of the problem with some of this access, even if you wanted to access the loans, because there is, and I'll send you the information. I don't know if I sent it to you earlier. Solar Energy Group. It's a foundation. They will help you get loans from a green bank that the way it is, you're ending up taking it on your mortgage. However, because your electric bill comes lower and you pay it off over whatever 30 years, you're basically using the savings from your electric bill to pay the loan. So they basically give you the money up front to put on the solar. Each of the money you save from the solar goes towards paying back the loan, so you don't really feel the impact. So that's how the solar funds work. Now, part of the problem is that the individual homeowners, sometimes the electric companies are not passing it back the way it should. So then you'll see what's called community neighborhood solar groups. And so they put in as a group. So the savings that come back to the group, they can divide it up among the homeowners. So you definitely know you're getting your money, the difference that will pay down the loan that's now on your mortgage. So if you're mortgage free and you take this $50,000 loan, the savings you get on your electric bill will pay the loan. So that's why they say overall, it doesn't cost you anything.
Okay,
And
good.
the house gets transferred, that it goes, it's a lien, it'll go with, when you sell your house, the other person takes it over that you sell, but they will get a savings in the electric bill, and also the improvement will improve the equity on your home. So that's how that works.
Okay, great. Thank you. There's another question here. Antoinette, can we unmute everyone so that they can ask questions freely? I'm not sure if that's possible. Anyway, here's the question. How can those of us that live in Jamaica push for policies to raise awareness? I think that's the question. This is, we have
But
our
you
fellow people from Jamaica.
That's why I showed that slide of collaboration, and you see how many groups are there. So before you can get any policy, I would say find whichever groups there are. And there are several environmental groups in Jamaica. There are groups that are working on the sewage problem, just cleaning up the rivers. There are groups that are working on cockpit country. There are groups that are working on health. There's the Doctors Association. There are many groups. There's a large public health infrastructure there, and those groups. I would work in getting those grouped together before you then push for policy, because you need the collaboration to get the politicians to say you have a sizable enough vote that you're going to make an impact. So develop your collaborators, then go after with the politicians to make sure that they know. They also, within your own personal habit, I tell everybody, meatless Monday and shrimpless Saturday in the US. Shrimps, the way they're produced, it's very toxic to the environment. So I know a lot of folks will say, well, I'm giving up meat and don't go to shrimp. So shrimpless Saturdays, meatless Mondays, lots more plants. That's your first start. And when you shop, cut down all the plastic use as much as possible. And that's another thing that you can start doing. And get your community organizations together.
You know, Jamaica, we stopped with the single-use plastic. No more scandal bags. So that's a step.
But you still have a lot of styrofoam and single-use plastic utensils. That needs to go next, because there's a lot of energy used and those things are just discarded. And I think most of the islands, many of the islands are running out of landfill space. And if we don't decrease food waste and decrease styrofoam and plastic in other forms, and also when I know we do a lot of missions, I think there are like 360 something missions the last time I checked. I think the government needs to work with the missions and have them not bring down a lot of old clothes that won't be used, and not a lot of individually wrapped items that then get discarded. The mission should get rid of all the plastic and paper and stuff that they have wrapped, all those single toothbrushes and things that they're doing, and leave it in this country. Do not bring it to Jamaica for Jamaica to have to try and discard of all that plastic and single-use stuff that we bring. All those little hotel bottles of shampoos and things, do not take those, because it just ends up, the island has to dispose of all this Western waste. Hard soaps rather than those Bath and Body Works little things that everybody gets, because the island has to get rid of all that plastic. So I think that's where the diaspora can start getting the diaspora together to understand when it brings things to the island, the impact it has on the waste. And even all the water bottles, doing as much as you can to bring sustainability with the diaspora when you come down.
Wow. That's interesting. I'm sure many of us had never thought of that.
Yeah, yeah.
Are there any questions from
There's another question. Well, others are unmuting, and then the Zoom on YouTube.
Okay.
Somebody asked, does Florida not have subsidies? Richie asked, does Florida not have subsidies for low-income customers to help pay for energy costs? And I think you had mentioned that the
I must tell you, the subsidy, LIHEAP, that's it, you got it. Low income energy relief system, but it's about $500 per person. So when you look at the heat that we had in July, I think it might do 1 month. It was designed to take care of several months, because the average bills were about 100 to maybe 150. But if you live in some of these poor homes that have bad insulation, their bills were like 150 or more. I'm sure this season it's like 200-300. So that LIHEAP funds may only last for 2 months. But it's better than nothing.
Yes.
And that was also expanded funding. So there'll be more people able to get dollars from that. That's also under the Inflation Act.
I know you talked about health and the intersection between health and climate, but you didn't get into a lot of it. Could you just expound a little bit more on some of the health conditions that you have seen in your practice and in general that are related to heat, especially?
Well, the thing with heat was very tricky, as I tell everyone, is that the acute in South Florida, it's very different than when you're up north, because South Florida and Jamaica, you acclimatize. It's always hot. So acclimatization protects you a lot more from some of the massive heat stroke and heat waves that we see in Europe and we see in the Northeast, where people drop dead in a week or two and they'll lose like hundreds. So what we have here is the worsening of underlying diseases. Or you will see the falls, the traumatic injuries, the mood changes, the
allergies,
the heat, you'll see the rashes, you'll see things that's related to heat and humidity. So the mold may grow more. So then the mold will trigger all your other problems. So it presents a little bit more, not complex, but it does trigger other things. And so when we code as doctors, the person would show up with an allergy and a rash, and they'll say skin rash. But that rash came because of all the other factors in the environment that were worsened by heat. Think about flooding. We have 100,000 septic tanks in Miami. Many of those septic tanks are overflowing. The sewage is getting into the water system. It goes in the bay. If there's a flood, because it rains so much now, heat and the climate change, when it rains, you're getting tons of rain in a short amount of time. Think of the evaporation. What goes up must come. So all that water is up in those clouds. So when it comes down in an hour, you'll get a tremendous amount of rain, which then backs up the sewage and spills into the water. The kid comes into the doctor and the mom said they're having a little diarrhea, a little rash. What will the doctor say? Oh, you got a rash. Are they all going to link it together because the septic tanks have been overflowing and creating nutrient-rich waters? Not being done consistently. So that's where the education comes in. We say, don't send any kids out to play in that water when there's flooding, because the sewage system has backed up. It comes up through the grates. it comes into the water. You see Miami Beach in a sunny day, all that water that comes up because our water table is very close to the ground. Florida is on limestone, very shallow. So the water is coming up from under the limestone and the water coming down in the rain. And then when the sewage and the septic tanks, which are now being disrupted because the water is coming up, they're not being emptied enough because the people are too poor. So all that sewage is coming out. It's a lot of dots to connect.
Yes, yes, definitely.
So that's why you may not see it and people say, oh, this is not a problem, but it really is a problem.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you. Are there any questions from our Zoom audience?
So
Yes, I have another question, Dr. Holder.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, ladies, you mentioned earlier about drinking water. You said tap water
Mhm.
here in Dade County. I'm scared.
Mhm.
Talk to me about tap
a lot
water.
of folks are scared, but
Yeah.
when you look at the data, there's testing, it's works. It's not bad. It's not causing diarrheal illnesses in water. So I tell folks, get a filter it out, but
Mhm.
it's really safe. Boil it if you have any concern, but
Yes.
to keep buying plastic bottles of water is just killing our environment. So I tell folks, run the tap, boil it and boil it and drink it and put it in containers that are reusable.
What about some of these osmosis machines in the supermarkets and so? What do you think about those?
The data doesn't support that it does anything better than the tap water we have.
Okay.
We have pretty potable water in the country for most parts, not like
Except for Flint's, yeah.
the problem in much in the Northeast is the pipes that
Mhm.
are old and corroded. So if your building is old and corroded, then your water, which is clean before it got to the pipes that come into your house, is the problem. It's not so much that the water, but it's the pipes. So this is what we're telling folks: change your pipes if you can afford it. We're trying to get landlords to change out the pipes because the problem is in the pipes and not so much in the water. And the US and the way the building, they made the codes for the pipes to be too small. So then it created more problems. And that's part of why the water is so dirty. But if filter it, boil it, and use it, stop buying all those plastic bottles.
Okay.
We have some hands.
We have some hands, yes. Go ahead, Carlene.
Karen, we have some hands. Karen, you can unmute and go ahead with your question. Karen Brown. Okay, there you go.
Thank you very much. Good evening. I'm learning so much. So I'm from Jamaica. I'm just wondering if you have any information on the use of SODIS, solar disinfection, where the light is used in maybe I don't know if glass or plastic bottles, containers, to help to disinfect water to make it safer for drinking when it is questionable in quality.
I couldn't tell you exactly how the best system is. I'd have to do the research on that. But I know there's lots of brand new technology out there, and definitely different rays will kill bacteria, different when the UV rays and the different rays that come through. So I can see that, but I don't know which one works. And in Jamaica, one thing I know with Jamaica's water before all the pollution, the water coming out of the ground was pretty decent with a good pH. Jamaica is known for having very good water. That's why so much of the beverages and the foods you make have that delicious taste, because the water is at a good pH and pretty good. Now, a lot of the water used to start in the cockpit country and come down through the river system. Now that's being very polluted. So, and also there's more disruption of that high part of the island. So I think your water may not be as good in the next 10 years, but in the past, the water was decent. And if you just boil it, it was pretty decent water.
Yes. Yes, thanks. Well, the reason why I agree with you that we have the best water in Jamaica. Yes, yes, I have environmental health. And so one of the roles involved having the water quality monitored and checked. So I agree with you. But unfortunately, there are times when we do have, some form of disruption.
Yeah, especially
So-
with the crowds. So then you will have the settling and bad water. Yeah.
I'm sure like some of the persons in the African continent who, they have issues. So they have utilized the solar disinfection method. So maybe
I'm sure it works. I just don't know the details.
right.
The physics behind it makes sense.
Right.
So it's just which one works and what level. And the other thing is that it works, but sometimes you really need it. I don't know, depending on the countries. There's some countries that are just really bad water. I don't know how bad Jamaica's is now.
Oh, we have good water.
Yeah.
The land of wood and water. Thank you, Karen, for that question. O'Neill is next on his iPad. He also had a question. You would unmute.
Good evening to everyone. Thank you very much. Dr. Older, your talk was very informative. My question is, as it relates to the plastic bottles, I know what you have said about plastic bottles, but drinking the tap water in Florida. But we know what the world is looking at when we see drinking water. There is an issue where the plastic bottles, we as Jamaicans, we are doing a project as it relates to the collection of these plastic bottles and reworking them into other materials so that it is beneficial to or a sustainable practice or environment. But as it relates to the US, what is the rate at which these plastic bottles are being collected? I know that some states do a number of recycling, but as it relates to Florida, what is the rate or percentage of collection and having a sustainable environment being practiced?
Okay, the data shows that most of recycling has failed in the US. Failed miserably. I think maybe less than 10% really is recycled. And what is recycled into has not been, it goes into other plastic that then doesn't really get recycled. So the whole recycling is turning out to be a big myth in this country. And what we're seeing is microplastic in the water. So that's the other big concern with the plastic, is that as it degrades over time, especially in the oceans, we're seeing microplastic in the food and the fish in every level. And we have it even crosses the blood-brain barrier. So there are microplastics probably in our brain and it's throughout our entire bodies. It's in the blood, it's everywhere. So we are accepting that recycling, as the US said, did not work because they lied. They did not follow through on the technology that they said they would. And so much of the plastic is new and it's not being recycled. And it's when China stopped taking everyone's garbage, that's when it really became obvious, because then the US got stuck with all this stuff that they were not recycling. And it became very evident that recycling didn't work. My community basically stopped recycling last year. They just said it was a waste of money because it got to the Broward system and Broward was not keeping up with the recycling. So recycling did not turn out well in the US, and you can look at our data. Now, since the US was trying to recycle it to make more plastic bottles, maybe that's the issue. Other countries are turning it into bricks and blocks and all sorts of other things. So maybe there is hope in other countries with the plastic, but our recommendation is to stop using as much as possible plastic. Move away from there's no reason to have plastic water bottles. There's no reason to drink 6 bottles of soda and things like we're doing. So again, these are health solutions. We need to stop the sodas and the juice and the plastic bottle drinking. Anyway, because it's killing us. We're getting obesity, we're getting diabetes, we're getting heart disease. So our climate solution is another health solution by going back to water in a reusable container.
Our climate solution is a health solution. That's excellent. That is excellent.
There's a question on YouTube related to what you just said. Can recycling work? Are there countries that are getting it right?
So far from what we've seen in the data, nobody is really able to beat the cost of new. So this is where, when we talk about fossil fuel companies being subsidized, it works in their best interest to just make a new plastic bottle. So would it work? Maybe if we didn't subsidize the fossil fuel companies, maybe it would work. If the true cost of making that new plastic bottle were in the plastic bottle, then maybe it would work. But from my understanding, there's some countries that are doing better at recycling, but what is really better is when they decrease the actual purchase, because I think Korea has a system where they have to recycle, but they're charged on how much garbage they put out. So there's a big push against buying stuff and buying a lot of unnecessarily wrapped things and having a lot of garbage. So even they do much more food. Food waste is big. And the second thing after plastic is food waste. And in our country, food waste is huge. Korea had a huge food waste problem too, and they're trying to cut back on the food waste problem by charging by how much you put out. So that's becoming much more successful. Smaller countries like the Netherlands also have community recycling centers where right on the block and you go out, and composting centers. And that has also been more effective. The US hasn't developed an effective system yet. New York is trying a big recycling and composting on the block. So hopefully that may help. But I think at this point, it only charging people. That helped in New York and other places where they charge you for the plastic bag. That also decreased use.
Speaking of composting, it made me think of the situation in Jamaica with the burning of the garbage.
Very bad.
Very bad.
But there's nowhere else. Your island is only so big. And you're running out of
space.
landfill. Yeah, there's no space. And the population is getting bigger. And the consumption habits are becoming very westernized. There are many countries where you should move back to like a banana leaf plate rather than a styrofoam container. Wrapping your foods takeout in things that can be biodegradable. And that may be where islands will have to push as we go forward, because what they're doing now is very expensive for the environment. And if, again, like all that styrofoam you get in those box lunches and all those meals, if the true cost were embedded in that, I think we would go back to banana leaf tie for everything. Or you bring a container and you fill it up when you get your lunch and you take it back with you, even if you went to a restaurant, because no restaurateur could afford a whole bunch of styrofoam to give away with lunch. So islands are going to have to come to terms with how they manage their garbage because nobody else wants it and they can't afford the true cost.
Wow.
Wow, a lot of food for thought.
A lot of food. Great information, Dr. Hope.
Answer is in the diet. More plant-based diet.
Yes.
Less processed food, less plastic, more walking, public transportation, going solar, and working as a community. And what else is going to make you happier than when you get your community working well? So every solution around climate change improves your health, improves your mental, physical health as we get our world safer and better for the next generations.
Wow. With regard to what you just said, Ricky on YouTube says, I'm reading about one alternative called, I think it's an eco-friendly alternative to plastic. I'm not able to read everything that he said. Carlene, can you see this?
B-plastic or some kind of a B-plastic.
E-plastic, okay.
Yeah, there are things that they're biodegradable.
Bioplastic.
They're bioplastic. There are things that are like bacteria can consume the plastic.
Mhm.
There are lots of solutions that are coming around making plastic better.
Mhm.
The issue that we have is the urgency. If you look at mid-century, the temperatures, because all of those plastic, if we can move to that way, that's good because we'll get rid of using fossil fuels. But if those ways end up using fossil fuel to manufacture, and we're back. So that's why we're saying, yes, that's a future, but many times in the immediate might be to look at what we already have. And what else than plants? I mean, they're right there. Those leaves.
Yes.
Serve as beautiful plates and you toss them. So there are things that we can do now, and that's where the future is. There's going to be a lot of technology to help solve this. Fission is coming, where we're going to be able to generate energy by collision of particles. That might be 10, 20 years off.
Yes.
But it's coming. How many of us will die while we're waiting for that, when there's some really solutions right here? Cut out meat, stop cutting down our trees, plant some more trees.
Karen says, grow your own food and backyard farming.
And there can be, maybe not everything, but there are certain crops you can grow pretty easily on your own.
Yes. Okay. I don't see any more comments or hands raised, so it's almost, I think it's 8:45, 8:46. This has been quite a discussion. And Dr. Holder, on behalf of our Health Task Force and the Jamaica Diaspora Task Force Action Network, I'd like to thank you so much for accepting the offer to come and speak to us tonight. You have left us with a lot to think about, a lot we have to do in order to change our behaviors and, to get our planet on the right track. And in the meantime, to improve our health. So thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate your time. I know personally how busy you are. So thank you. We cannot thank you enough. And last but not least, I'd like to thank our audience, both on YouTube and on Zoom, because without you, there would have been no discussion. We would have just been talking to ourselves. So we know you took the time out of your busy, but let's say you're tired. I know you're tired because most of you work today. And so for you to take the time to come and spend an hour and a half with us, I mean, we really, really appreciate that. So thank you for taking the time to be here. And I hope that you have learned something. You have decided as a result of this presentation that you're going to make some simple changes in your daily lives to improve the health of yourselves and or environment. Thank you all.